So the next type of non-democratic regime we could talk about are military regimes. Military leaders step onto the political stage during times of crisis. Often they say that they are reluctant. They're coming in for a very temporary period. They're only going to use restrictions until they can hand power back to some civilian government. Now, military regimes tend to lack a strong ideology. They tend to lack charismatic or traditional sources of legitimacy normally, and instead they rely on rational legal authority, okay, or legitimacy. You need us to do this for security, for the sake of security. So they can come to power through a coup d'etat, where they take government by force, but they can be popularly supported, or they can be quite elite. They can actually go against much of what the population wants, at least initially. What's important, though, is that they are not at all populistic in rule. And the picture that you see here, well, we'll talk about this in a moment or two, highlights how the military can actually be quite popular. What you see here is Thailand in 2006, where people literally put flowers all over the tanks and were quite happy. But going back to this point, so it's a rational authority. They can be populist or they can be elitist, and they are not populist in, I should say popular versus elitist, but they are not populist in how they run the state. They tend to run the state through bureaucratic authoritarianism, where the bureaucracy and the military share a similar belief that you need a technocratic government to get the job done. Populist policies are a recipe for disaster. We need to make tough decisions for the good of the country. Okay? And so we want to go from A to Z, and we don't want to stop at B, C, D, etc. So it might be a little bit painful, but we can do this. There are some cases, by the way, in which the military has actually ruled for quite long periods. But these are anomalies for the most part. South Korea, for example, the military came to power there in 1960 in the face of social unrest, which followed from a series of failed reforms and the perceived threat of communism. So the military stepped in to protect the state from this communist threat. And they stepped in part through mechanisms of electoral democracy. The top military brass ran in semi-fair elections. I should say, I'm sorry, the military coup was not at all democratic, but they maintained power through mechanisms of electoral democracy in subsequent years. So the top military brass ran in semi-fair elections through the late 1980s. Now, during this period, you had a period of enormous economic growth. GDP climbed about 8% per year from the 1960s to 1980s. This is an Asian tiger. They relied on export-oriented industrialization with a heavy state role. So they used subsidies and protection. But there was also significant repression of activists and the opposition. So these were highly illiberal states. This included attacks on demonstrators on one occasion, killing up to 2,000 people in 1980. But note that the South Korean military allowed for elections within a few years of taking power. Many other examples are more typical of military regimes, where the military abdicates a direct role in governance fairly quickly. For example, Thailand and Honduras. So, in Thailand in September of 2006, there was an elected government under Prime Minister Thaksin. Prime Minister Thaksin was widely accused of corruption, including by the military general. The military canceled the upcoming elections. They abrogated the constitution. They dissolved parliament. They banned protests and all political activities. They suppressed and censored the media. They declared martial law and they arrested cabinet members. This is something that from an observer point of view, should have been something that people didn't really like. In fact, they should have been actively opposed to this, maybe a civil war. Yet this was widely popular. Again, people handed out flowers to the troops in the street. What this popularity did is it gave the military time. A military-appointed tribunal outlawed Prime Minister Thaksin's party, the Thai Rak Thai, and they banned its leaders from contesting elections in subsequent years. Finally, under international pressure, they allowed for democratic elections in December of 2007. So they were in power for about nearly a year and a half, between a year and a half, thanks in part to this popularity. Now, another case from fairly recently is the case of Honduras, where in June of 2009, President Zelaya, democratically elected, was taken out by the military after he had promised to eliminate presidential term limits. The military stormed the presidential palace. They sent him to Costa Rica, imposed exile. They replaced him with someone from his party, Roberto Micheletti, who promised to fix the country's finances and hold elections in November. This was the case where the coup was unpopular with many segments of the population. There were protests in the streets. So people didn't necessarily oppose eliminating presidential term limits, unlike in Thailand, where they were clearly worried about corruption. Okay, so this was unpopular, and this unpopularity also helped to lead about a quick turnaround. In November of 2009, so after just 4 or 5 months, you had elections, and Zelaya's last rival won 56% of the vote and became president. Zelaya, who was in exile in the Dominican Republic, was then allowed by the guy who won the elections, Porfirio Lobo, to return in May of 2011. He was greeted by crowds as a hero, and Zelaya appealed for political reconciliation. And in July of 2011, the Lobo government actually established a truth commission to investigate the coup, which he ultimately profited from, of course. And his human rights record has also been criticized. The point, several points to remember here are that, one, military regimes typically come to power during periods of crisis. Two, they generally promise to step down quickly, and often they will step down quickly. In the process, though, this is, I guess, three, they tend to dictate the terms. For example, banning parties in the case of Thailand, or certain individuals in the case of Honduras from taking office. So they control the tempo, they control the process of change. And again, they might be popular when they come to power, but they are not at all populist. I will change that slide that says populist. I apologize for that. Now, where they don't step down fairly quickly, it's often the case that they've morphed into another regime type. So there are lots of cases where we think, oh, this military regime has been there for 15 years, 20 years. Often this is morphed into another regime type. And often single-party regimes and military regimes gradually evolve into what we call personalistic regimes. And here's a picture of Pinochet from Chile on the left and the Saudi King Abdullah on the right. Personalistic regimes include monarchies, but there are also other regimes that are run primarily by one person. In other words, in a personalistic regime, there's an overriding powerful figure. He or she is the only one suitable to run the country, by self-definition. There's a lack of a clear regime. Again, a regime being norms, rules, procedures that structure expectations of behavior. Often there's a lack of ideology. The ruler simply claims to be the embodiment of the state and society. There can often be a personality cult, although this isn't necessary. We'll talk about personality cults in a moment. In personalistic regimes, the ruler tends to rely on an extraordinarily small group of supporters around him or her. But they tend to also owe more to the leader than he owes to them. So this small group of supporters, it really doesn't want to leave this group because they can be on the out. Maybe they can be killed or imprisoned for being traitors. But at a minimum, they're going to lose all the great stuff they're getting. Okay, so they owe much more to that leader than he owes to them. And not coincidentally, leaders occasionally change up the membership, sometimes very violently, by killing off members of this inner circle for a couple of reasons. One, to ensure compliance from others in the group, to increase the risk of defection, again. And second, to offer hope to those who are outside of this group that they could one day get a chance to be part of this elite circle. Often, the way personalistic regimes end is through the death of the leader. Because then you have essentially an implosion where people from within the winning coalition or this circle of supporters fight with one another in order to attain power. Personality cults occur where the leader is said to embody the best of the nation. Okay, notice I said nation and not state. And declares himself or herself essentially worthy of worship. This is quasi-religious. It's usually facilitated by top-down indoctrination to create this charismatic form of authority, legitimacy. So these leaders will use the schools, they'll use media, film, plays, the walls, right? Graffiti on the walls, everywhere they can in order to indoctrinate the people. And in this process, anything that's bad in the state, and people will find bad things. The leader will point out bad things potentially, but that's the fault of someone lower down. Okay, and people begin to believe this, so that if they find, for example, corruption, they'll say, "Oh, only if our great leader knew about this." One of the reasons for this is that these personalistic regimes with personality cults monopolize information and convince the people that there are threats to order. Okay, this is the lowest common denominator. There are threats to the current order. We need a good guy to come in or to stay here and to save us, even though he may do some things that no one, including him, wants to. Some rough, heavy-handed tactics. These are inevitable because he needs to protect us. So a lot like military regimes from that perspective. Okay, there's a great rationale for why they're in power. Personalistic regimes with cults of personality can play on traditional cultural values, especially hierarchy, obedience. They can also be characterized by charismatic leadership, okay, a strong orator, or they can be founded on rationality. I have the skills needed to get the job done. So typical examples of this are Hitler, Stalin, Mao. These are all leaders who had this cult of personality. But there are others out there. Here's one you probably haven't heard of, Turkmenbashi, Sapir Murat Niyazov, the head of Turkmenistan until his death in 2006. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, he wrote this thing on the far right. You can see it's called the Ruhnama. It combines spiritual and moral guidance. It's part autobiography and part revisionist history. So it's almost like a Bible of sorts that puts this guy on a pedestal, and he essentially made it compulsory. He imposed it on religious communities. He imposed it on society at large. If you want to pass educational exams, you need to know the Ruhnama. In order to get state employment, the one employer that you can count on, you need to pass the Ruhnama. In order to get a driver's license, you need to pass your exam on the Ruhnama. It's also been translated into many languages. So here are some quotes, just to give you an idea of how personalistic regimes with cults of personality work. Your joy and sadness are mine too. So notice this personalization of society. I embody society. I am pleased to serve you and to fulfill my responsibilities for the purpose of making your lives easier. So I'm working with you and for you. I'm your humble servant. Let our spiritual strength be an example to the world at large. So note here this grandiose universalistic characterization of the leader as the representative of society. Now, where you go from quasi-religious to truly religious, you have what we call theocracies. Theocracy meaning rule by God. These can take different shapes depending on the ruling religion. There are relatively few of these out here. A prime example, which we'll talk about in a moment later in this class, is Iran, where you have institutions. All state institutions are checked by religious leaders. Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001 might have qualified. Clerics ruled based on the interpretation of Islamic law. In many other cases, you've got combinations, for example, of monarchy and elements of theocracy. This was historically common. Picture the Crusaders. You had the Russian Tsar, who was empowered by being, quote-unquote, God-chosen. But those are not theocracies. So a classic theocracy, Iran. The picture that you see here is Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is actually a title granted to the top Shia, demonstrating expertise in Islamic studies. The supreme ruler of Iran is an Ayatollah, but not every Ayatollah is going to be the supreme leader. Ayatollah Khomeini is the gatekeeper of Iranian politics. You can't get involved in politics without his permission, either directly by him or indirectly through his council of guardians. So it's not just the dominance of Sharia law, of Muslim Islamic law, but it's also the dominance of state institutions by religious leaders who act as guides for the state. Khomeini's revolutionary idea of vilayat-e-faqih, guardianship of the jurist, meant that the state was going to be supervised and the society was going to be supervised by the leading Islamic jurists. So the Iranian state is designed to give this leading cleric, the supreme leader, a trump. You've got a powerful presidency, but it's checked by the fact that the supreme leader vets all presidential candidates and controls the military and his own paramilitary, the Revolutionary Guard. You've got a potentially powerful legislature, but it's hamstrung by the fact that its laws are subject to the approval of two other supervisory boards or bodies whose memberships are directly or indirectly chosen by the supreme leader. So to summarize here, theocracies involve not just laws based on religious texts or interpretations, but also a state apparatus that's run by religious leaders and according to rules derived from these religious tenets. Now, topologies, of course, are made to be broken, and regimes can morph from one type into another, as I've already alluded to. So you could have transitions from one regime to another and back, for example, with the Soviet Union. With the death of Lenin, who created the Soviet Union, Stalin, who I mentioned when we talked about cult of personalities, began to consolidate power over several years. Okay, gradually excluding opponents from the Politburo even before 1928. This was a single-party regime until Stalin, by 1929, had turned it into a personalistic regime, promoting this cult of personality, starting with enormous propaganda surrounding his 50th birthday. At the same time, he undermined the party relative to himself by orchestrating a series of purges at all levels in the 1930s. He was literally killing people in the party off and calling them traitors, counter-revolutionaries. From the top party elites and military brass down to industry, cultural organizations, even the secret police itself, Stalin was the only one untainted. He was the embodiment of the good nation. But a few years after Stalin's death, Khrushchev manages to consolidate power and begins a process of de-Stalinization. Note, this was not Khrushchevization. He didn't have the power for that, so there was no cult of personality around him, but it was debunking the myth of this father Stalin and raising the role of the party again. So here you went from a single-party regime to a personalistic regime, and then under Khrushchev, back to a single-party regime. In Chile, there was a military junta, like in other parts of South America, but it gave way to a personalistic regime under Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet consolidated his authority in 1974. He declared himself president, despite some dissent from within the military, especially from the Air Force general. And he further consolidated power through the 1980 Constitution, which gave him 8 more years as president. So here's a military junta, a military regime becoming a single, a personalistic regime. Another lesson here is that regime types can overlap. Iran, for example, was a single-party theocracy from 1987 until the mid-1990s. And then it became much more similar to a competitive authoritarian theocracy today. And then there's the big problem of categorizing these very non-transparent regime types. Look at North Korea. Is this a single-party regime? Is it a personalistic one? Maybe is it a military one? Probably not military. But clearly the Communist Party rules, but at the end of the day, it's really one person who rules, and with a very, very small clique. Okay. Zimbabwe, another example. Robert Mugabe may have been a strong leader, but at the end of the day, he was constrained by his party. So is this a single-party regime? I think it probably was, but some people might be able to make the argument that it was a personalistic regime. I think the fact that he was constrained by his party makes that less likely. But again, the lack of transparency can make it hard to tell. Regime type is defined by constraints of rule, methods of attaining and maintaining power, the relationship to other state and societal organizations. And if we can't see these things, then it's very difficult to actually categorize the regimes. So we'll go on in a moment.